Hey, what's going on, everyone? We're talking about the Silent Hill 2 remake and its newest update, patch 1.04. Now, if you've been following this game since its launch, you already know it's been a bit of a mixed experience for a lot of players. Some folks love it, others have had their share of frustrations with performance, visuals, or little gameplay quirks that didn't quite live up to expectations. But this new patch actually brings a surprising amount of meaningful fixes and even some new features, especially for PC players. So let's go through what's actually changed, what still needs work, and why this update might finally make the game feel smoother and more stable for everyone. So first off, patch 1.04 dropped quietly but quickly made waves once players realized how much was actually packed in. The biggest thing people are talking about is the performance improvements, especially on PC. Bloober team added proper support for DLSS 3 frame generation and NVIDIA Reflex, which basically means if you're running one of the newer RTX 40 series GPUs, you can now get significantly higher frame rates without that choppy feeling. Reflex also helps reduce input lag, so everything feels more responsive, especially in combat or when moving the camera around quickly. Before this update, some folks complained about how sluggish the game could feel on high-end systems, and now, after testing it myself, it genuinely feels tighter and cleaner. It's still not perfect, but there's a night and day difference if you compare it to how it launched. Now, not everyone's on NVIDIA hardware, and thankfully Bloober didn't forget about AMD users either. The patch also introduced AMD's FSR 3.1.1 with support for AFMF, which stands for AMD Fluid Motion Frames. That's their version of frame generation, and while it's not exactly identical to NVIDIA's tech, it still gives a huge performance bump on supported cards. Players using mid-range GPUs like the RX 6700 or 7800 XT have reported smoother gameplay at higher resolutions without those heavy frame drops that used to happen in open areas or complex lighting zones. Basically, the game is starting to run closer to what you'd expect from a modern horror remake. And it's not just about boosting frames or adding toggles in the graphics menu. This patch also tackled some of the more annoying bugs that have been around since release. If you've played through the story, you probably remember moments where the game would stutter for no reason, like when transitioning between rooms or when certain lighting effects popped in suddenly. Patch 1.04 fixed a lot of those small but immersion-breaking hitches. You can tell the asset streaming has been tweaked because loading feels snappier and textures appear more consistently, instead of that weird moment where you walk into an area and textures take a second or two to sharpen up. A few very specific bugs were also finally addressed. There was one where James would still have his wooden plank weapon visible during his death animation. Yeah, it looked ridiculous and kind of killed the tension in those moments. That's been cleaned up. They also fixed an odd issue with the peephole interaction, where players could get stuck or teleported incorrectly when trying to peek through it. That one caught a few people off guard in earlier versions, and it's nice to see it finally resolved. Some audio issues were also patched up, especially those weird audio portals that would occasionally cause sound effects to cut in and out abruptly. You know when you're walking and suddenly all ambient sound just stops for a second? That's been significantly reduced. But there's a catch, and it's something you need to know before loading up your save file. There's a new bug that appeared with this update that affects the Labyrinth section of the game. Basically, if you saved your progress before patch 1.04, but you were already past Toluca Prison and had entered the Labyrinth, those saves might become partially broken. Players have reported they couldn't progress normally, certain events wouldn't trigger, or key objects wouldn't load properly. Bloober already acknowledged the issue and said they're working on a fix, but if you're currently around that part of the game, the best advice is to load an older save from before entering the Labyrinth, or just start that section fresh on the new patch. It's not ideal, but at least the team has been transparent about it. Now, for PlayStation 5 players, the update might not sound as dramatic since most of the graphics tech improvements are specific to PC, but don't worry, there's still plenty of good stuff here. Stability has improved quite a bit on console. Before, there were random crashes during cutscenes or transitions, especially when going from exploration to combat or when the game streamed in new areas. Those have been cleaned up, and PS5 players are reporting far fewer crashes now. The motion blur setting was also acting weird before. Sometimes turning it off didn't actually disable it fully. That's been fixed, so if you're one of those people who can't stand motion blur, you can finally play the game the way you want without that extra smear on fast movements. There were also little localization and UI details that got some love. The high graphics preset in the options menu had a translation issue in a few languages, and it's been corrected. It's a small thing, but it shows they're starting to pay attention to the finer polish that's needed for a remake of such a legendary game. Silent Hill 2 has a huge reputation, and fans notice everything, from the way fog density behaves to how James' flashlight interacts with different surfaces. And speaking of that, the patch also quietly improved lighting stability. Some users noticed that dynamic shadows wouldn't render properly when the flashlight hit certain textures. That's been tuned to look more natural now. Now, beyond the technical stuff, there's an interesting discussion happening around how this patch changes the feel of the game overall. One of the biggest complaints after launch was that while the remake looked modern, it didn't feel as atmospheric as the original. Part of that was due to stuttering and inconsistent frame pacing, which constantly pulled players out of the experience. With a smoother performance and fewer distractions, the tension and pacing feel much closer to what Bloober probably intended. You're able to get lost in those foggy streets or claustrophobic hallways without being yanked back to reality by a hitch or crash. The game's eerie mood benefits immensely from consistency. If you're playing on PC, this is also the first patch that really rewards tweaking your settings. Now, you can actually balance performance and visuals properly. Before, turning on ray tracing or running at 4K basically tanked your frame rate unless you had an absolute monster GPU. Now with DLSS frame generation or FSR AFMF on, you can comfortably hit 90 to 120 frames per second depending on your setup. Reflex also helps so much with combat responsiveness. It doesn't feel floaty anymore. You can tell where your inputs land, and that gives the game a slightly more grounded feel without changing its pacing. Something worth mentioning too is that the Steam Deck crowd seems really happy with this update. Before this patch, performance on the deck was rough, lots of drops, heavy stutter, and blurry upscaling. Patch 1.04 actually optimized a bunch of background systems, and now it's not perfect, but it's totally playable. People are getting more consistent frame rates, and loading zones feel less heavy. It's still a demanding title for handheld hardware, but the improvements make it viable for those who want to experience Silent Hill on the go. So overall, what we're seeing here is the game finally starting to feel stable and optimized in a way it probably should have been at launch. It's been a rocky road, but credit where it's due. Bloober team is actually listening. You can tell they're trying to respond to community feedback instead of just dropping small hotfixes. They're tackling major performance and gameplay issues head on, and that's exactly what this remake needed. Of course, it doesn't magically fix every complaint people had about the tone or atmosphere, but at least now the technical side isn't getting in the way as much. If you've been holding off on starting your first playthrough, this might be the right time. The fog effects are smoother, the lighting feels better balanced, and the frame rate stability means you can actually enjoy those cinematic moments without interruptions. Just keep that Labyrinth bug in mind. Either avoid loading into it from an old save, or wait for the next mini patch if you're deep into that section. And if you're someone who already finished the game and just wants to revisit it with higher performance, the difference is noticeable enough to make another run worth it, especially on PC. Cranking up DLSS with frame generation makes it feel fluid in a way it never did before. It also highlights how impressive the art direction actually is when the game isn't struggling to render it smoothly. The fog density, the reflective surfaces, even the subtle facial animations, all of that lands harder when the frame pacing isn't hitching. It's also kind of refreshing to see a horror remake that's improving post-launch instead of fading away after the first few months. It feels like Bloober wants to refine this version over time rather than just moving on to the next project. Considering the weight of the Silent Hill name, that's exactly the kind of long-term support fans were hoping for. So yeah, patch 1.04 might not sound huge just from the version number, but it's a major quality of life step for Silent Hill 2 Remake. Between the addition of DLSS 3, Reflex, FSR 3.1.1, and the various stability and bug fixes, this is the most polished state the game has been in so far. It's not flawless. There are still camera quirks and occasional hiccups, but it's finally crossing that line from rough but playable to genuinely enjoyable. If you've been frustrated by the technical hiccups before, now's a great time to give it another shot. And if you're on PS5, you might not notice massive visual leaps, but the smoother stability definitely makes it a better overall experience. I think that's the best thing to take away from this update. It finally feels like the remake is respecting the mood and pacing that made the original so iconic. No more distractions, just that slow, unnerving journey through the fog. Anyway, that's what's new with the Silent Hill 2 Remake update. It's nice to finally be able to talk about it in a positive light instead of just listing out issues. The game still has a few corners to smooth out, but this patch shows clear progress. So if you've been waiting to jump back in, now might be the time. Let me know what platform you're playing on and how the update's been running for you. Whether you've noticed the performance gains, smoother visuals, or maybe even that Labyrinth bug. I'm really curious to hear how it's holding up across different setups. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I'll catch you in the next one.